Hi, so welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our WWF Learn to Love Nature webinar. So thank you for everybody that's joining us on Zoom and also on YouTube. So today we're going to be looking at the illegal wildlife trade. So illegal and unsustainable wildlife trade is one of the major threats to many of our world's species, and it's one of the most important and urgent parts of our work here at WWF. So my name's Caroline, and I'm your host for today, and I'm going to be joined by Paul, our Chief Wildlife Advisor at WWF UK. He's going to be doing today's presentation, and then after that, we're going to introduce to you Kate from an organisation called Tale2Tail, and we've been working with this small charity on some of our illegal wildlife trade resources that you can find on our website. So after this presentation, we would love to hear your questions for both Kate and Paul. If you're on Zoom, you can do this via the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to as many of these as possible at the end. And if you're joining us on YouTube, unfortunately, you won't be able to submit any of your questions, but we hope that you still enjoy the presentation. So, Paul, welcome to our webinar, and I'll pass it over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Caroline. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So as Caroline said, my name is Paul Dearnellis. I work at WWF as the Chief Advisor Wildlife, and we'll be talking to you this afternoon about illegal wildlife trade. Hopefully over the course of the session, we'll obviously learn a bit more about the trade and its impact on wildlife, but also on people, as well as some of the things that we could do to try and address those impacts. So I thought we'd start with what wildlife trade is. So wildlife trade is the sale or exchange of wild animal and plant resources by us, by people. It involves thousands of different species, and these are used for a range of purposes. Some of them you can see in the pictures here. There's medicines, construction, clothing, food, obviously, but also sort of cultural items and ornaments and other things like that. Millions of people depend on wildlife resources, and for as long as people have existed, we've used wildlife resources. But as Caroline said at the start, unsustainable exploitation of wildlife, sometimes linked to illegal wildlife trade, is one of the biggest threats to biodiversity that we see today. So, having introduced wildlife trade, what about illegal wildlife trade? What species do we think are affected by illegal wildlife trade? So hopefully we'll have a poll coming up. Thank you. So what are those species? So we have a list of possibilities. You can choose one, you can choose all. So I'm interested to see what we think. And hopefully the results will come up and we'll get to see them in just a moment. Okay. All right. Excellent. There we go. So the results we have in quite a range there. So I think everyone recognised that rhino are affected. A lot of us tiger. About half for parrots. Rosewood less so, and tuna as well. But I am interested to see that all were represented. And so if we can move on to our next slide. Yeah, so having seen those results, I'm pleased in the sense that you're right, that a whole range of species, both animals and plants, are affected by illegal wildlife trade. So we have the rhinos and the tigers down there that perhaps we'd more readily associate, but then there's also perhaps some less well-known species. And then timber, things like rosewood, and you can see the reason it's got its name there, the red sap in the tree, and but also exotic flowers, and then even things that we consume for food, and perhaps people don't always associate with legal wildlife trade, like tuna. And so the illegal wildlife trade, wildlife crime, is a serious crime. Involves often criminal activity, sometimes very well organized criminal activity, and it's been estimated to be worth between 15 and 20 billion pounds per year in terms of illicit trade, and is ranked as perhaps the fourth largest criminal activity, transnational criminal activity, excuse me, alongside such things as drug trafficking, human trafficking, and counterfeit goods trafficking. And one thing that would be important to take away from this is obviously illegal wildlife trade affects wildlife and the places that wildlife live, but it also impacts on people. And often the people who live alongside wildlife are some of the poorest and most marginalized in the world and most vulnerable to exploitation by the criminals involved in wildlife crime. So let's jump in, looking at some of the species that are affected by wildlife trade. And I'll start, if it works, with a short video. And this is looking at an Asian big cat affected by illegal wildlife trade, but perhaps not the stripy one that you might immediately think of. So this video collects camera trap footage of snow leopards, and the keen-eyed amongst you will notice another species, which hopefully I won't need to identify for you. Camera traps are traps that are put up in the field, in the wild. They are triggered by, they're motion sensitive, and they can take pictures or, in this case, videos. And we use them to enable us to monitor wildlife, look at behavior, like these snow leopards that seem a bit unimpressed by this camera that's been put up in their path. But also you can use them to monitor illegal activity and give alerts for poachers and so on. Oh, let's not do that. There we go. So snow leopards, as the name suggests, tend to be found in cold climates, but around the high mountains of Central and South Asia. There are somewhere in the region of about 4,500 to 7,500. They're quite hard to count, actually, but they are estimated to be vulnerable to the threat of extinction and are currently found, I think, in around 12 countries. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about snow leopards is that it illustrates some of the complexities of illegal wildlife trade and how the threats that snow leopards face, including illegal wildlife trade, interact. So I mentioned that snow leopards live in those high mountains. Those are mountains that are undergoing a lot of habitat change. So the habitat that the snow leopards live in and depend on is changing rapidly, particularly as climate change warms the world. Those mountain habitats are particularly vulnerable. Also, snow leopards live alongside people. Like, probably as long as people have existed, they've lived alongside snow leopards. And those people, many of them depend on livestock, so sheep and goats. They depend on those for food, depend on those for their income. And as you can see from that slightly distressing picture up at the top there, those livestock can also be targeted by snow leopards, which are also looking for food. And you can understand that for those communities, that can be a devastating loss and can lead to conflict between the communities and the snow leopards, and sometimes even retaliatory killing as people look to protect their livestock. And you can see a trap there that has been used. But snow leopards are also affected by illegal wildlife trade. You can see at the bottom there some products, clothing, but also things like rugs and furnishings. Although that trade is illegal, demand in places like where we live here in the UK and Europe and East Asia drives a market for illegal wildlife trade. And you can imagine, as people are poaching for illegal wildlife trade, if you've got conflict with people and pressure as habitat is degraded, these things can interact and create really a difficult situation for snow leopards. But it's not hopeless for snow leopards, and organizations like WWF, who work with the local communities there, supporting sustainable livelihoods, helping them look for ways that they can protect their livestock, reducing conflict with snow leopards, and also supporting them as they try to protect snow leopards and other wildlife from poachers. So, what's this? Hopefully, you can guess what sort of animal it is. And hopefully that one will bring it home to you. This is a chameleon, a type of lizard, which hopefully some of you will be familiar with. Many of them can change their color. They have an incredible ability to adapt to their surroundings or even reflect their mood. And also, as you can see in this picture, they have an amazing ability to extend their tongue, fire it out incredibly fast to catch their prey. But why am I showing you pictures of chameleons? It's because chameleons are a species that are targeted for the global pet trade. And it's important that we recognize that it's not just about things being targeted for things like snow leopard skin or ivory, but that live animal trade, the pet trade, is also an issue. Here we see someone from the UK Border Force, so customs based at Heathrow. And in 2015, they had a seizure that this picture is taken from when 400 live tortoises were seized, I think 10,000 dried seahorses, nearly 200 rare gecko lizards, and this chameleon, which was concealed in a handbag, were all seized in one consignment. And the UK, Europe, North America are some of the major destinations for live pet trade, reptiles, birds, and other animals, often rare and often traded illegally. So it illustrates that this is a global problem and that we all have a part to play. And this, what does this look like? You have already seen where this comes from. This is a close-up of an animal that we saw in an earlier slide. It's from a pangolin. So pangolins, if you haven't heard them before, aren't reptiles, though they may look a little bit like reptiles. They are, in fact, the only scaly mammal. There are 8 species of pangolin, 4 in Asia, 4 in Africa, and they are insectivores, meaning they eat insects. They have a very long tongue that they use to eat mostly ants and termites, and the claws that you can maybe just see on their front legs, they can use to break open those termite mounds. But sadly, pangolins have the unwanted tag of being the most heavily trafficked wild mammal on the planet. And we estimate that anywhere up to 1 million or more pangolins have been traded in the last 10 to 15 years, taken illegally from the wild and brought into trade. And why are they being traded? Partly for these sorts of things. You can see there that that's a pangolin skin, which used to be used for shoes and other clothing, particularly in North America. But pangolins are also targeted for food. They've probably been targeted for food as long as people and pangolins have lived together. But that's the extent of that has increased dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years. And they're also targeted for East and Southeast Asian traditional medicinal uses. And the pangolin populations in Asia have declined dramatically as a result of demand for their scales and other body parts. And we're also seeing in Africa, particularly over the last 10 years, the pangolin species, and this is a little black-bellied pangolin, we're seeing those populations being targeted for the global trade, primarily going to East and Southeast Asia. And this not only impacts pangolins, obviously, but in some of the remote parts of West and Central Africa, communities there depend on pangolins and have done for millennia for food and income. So this illustrates how this global illegal wildlife trade can impact, again, on local communities and often some of the most vulnerable and marginalized communities on the planet. And staying in Africa, another possibly weird looking picture. What do we think is going on here? Looks like someone in full sort of scuba gear about to jump into the water. And what they're doing is that they are targeting something called abalone. Now you can see the diver here has 2 in their hands. These are a mollusk, so almost a giant sea snail that are subject of illegal wildlife trade. In the box just at the bottom of the image there, you may see or make out, should I say, a picture. They look almost like oysters. And although I've never eaten them myself, I'm assured that they are a delicacy, particularly in Asian cuisine. And over the last 20 years, we've seen poaching of an estimated 100 million abalone around the coastal seas of South Africa. This is linked to criminal gangs who traffic these poached abalone around the world, but particularly to Asian markets. Estimated at around about 2,000 tons taken per year and shipped, smuggled overseas. Estimated also to be valued up to about 45 or 50 million pounds per year. And that's those levels of harvesting are around 20, 25 times higher than the legal trade. We see here a legal trade that could be sustainable and support those local communities being blown away and undermined by criminal gangs, poaching, and the illegal wildlife trade. And the population of this abalone mollusk have crashed around South Africa. And obviously this has going to have severe impacts both for the species and the system, but also for the people who depend on that trade. So we have a girl playing a piano. It might seem a little odd. What's that doing in a illegal wildlife trade presentation? Perhaps this image might give you a better idea why we're looking at a piano. So ivory, elephant ivory. So people have used ivory from elephants for various things, probably for millennia. For example, in colonial times, Western European countries, including the UK, extracted huge amounts of ivory from Africa, killing elephants and taking the ivory away for products as mundane as billiard balls, piano keys, hence the girl playing the piano, and even things like heat-proof handles for teapots. Today, demand for ivory is possibly the single biggest threat facing the African elephant. International trade is illegal, and many countries have closed their own markets to ivory, but still the illegal trade continues. And we estimate that anywhere between 15 and 20,000 elephants are killed every year to supply demand for ivory. Today, mostly that goes to East and Southeast Asia. China is a major destination, although in recent years, China has put a ban in place on its ivory market. So hopefully that will improve things, and other countries are taking similar steps. The UK, for example, has put in place a ban on almost all trade in ivory here in the UK. Having talked about elephant ivory, we're going to ask you another question, which may seem a bit odd, given what we just looked at the last couple of slides. But where does ivory come from? And we've got another few species there. Again, you can choose one. You can choose more than one. We have the hippopotamus, the walrus, the narwhal, and the warthog. So which, if any, or how many of them do we think might be sources of ivory? Another few seconds to answer that, and hopefully we will get to see what we all think in just a moment. There we go. Interesting. So let's look at those. So almost everyone reckons that you can get ivory from walrus. Most people think the same for warthog, and over half, nearly 2/3, for both narwhal and hippopotamus. Okay, well, let's have a look and see. So once again, I've been a little bit unfair in that they're all sources of ivory. So up there we can see hippo, and the hippo tooth that hippo showing off is sometimes used and carved. And the same for the warthog tusk. Everyone nearly thought or recognized that walruses and that long overgrown tooth that they have there is used by particularly Inuit people up in the Arctic regions to make items like that. And then also, I was pleased to see that we recognize the narwhal as well. So that's a whale that's found in northern climes, Arctic region. And the male has a tooth that grows sort of through the front of its head like that. That is sometimes used as a sort of ivory type substitute. And one of the reasons I wanted to show you that was just to illustrate that ivory doesn't just come from elephants. And for some of these species, the use of ivory isn't illegal and actually isn't a threat to the species. So it's just something to bear in mind whenever we hear people talking about ivory. This species is a source of ivory, but it's not threatened by ivory. And that's because the mammoth is obviously extinct. But people do dig up mammoth tusks, and they are used in the same way for carvings and ornaments and cultural items in much the same way as those other species that do exist today that we were just talking about. But you can imagine that if you are a customs officer or from law enforcement and you're seeing these different items that are made supposedly of ivory, how do you recognize which is the illegal ivory, which is from the species that's threatened by the ivory trade? And although you can't quite see here, there are ways that you can tell the difference. So this is a slightly blurred image, but hopefully you can begin to see that's the surface of a tusk. And on that are hatched lines. These are called Schrager lines. And they are important identifiers that law enforcement can use to tell elephant ivory from other sources of ivory. And here we have an example viewed through a slightly magnifying lens. Mammoth ivory on the left there, you can see these Schrager lines. These hatched lines have a much more acute, sharper angle than on the right side there, where for elephants they're broader and they can tell them apart. So if someone is trying to say, I've got mammoth ivory, and in fact it looks under a microscope like the example on the right, then they're trading it illegally and trying to pass it off. It's elephant ivory they're trying to pass off as mammoth ivory. So we've talked about a few species that are affected by illegal wildlife trade and some of the complexity there, but what can we do about it? So at WWF, we look at it from one end of the trade chain, if you think about it, to the other. So we look at stopping the poaching. We have a zero poaching campaign. We also look at stopping the trafficking. So the stopping the poaching is about strengthening the field protection for wildlife where they're found, conservation, and also wildlife stewardship. Stopping the trafficking is looking at the smuggling angle. The criminals, as they move wildlife products from where the wildlife is found to the people who are doing the consuming at the other end. And we also look to address the buying, stopping the buying, by looking at consumer demand and behavior change. And we'll come to that in just a second. So zero poaching is obviously partly about rangers and local communities protecting wildlife, but it's also about understanding the threats that are involved. There may be aspects of technology. We looked at camera traps earlier that can help identify illegal activities and target poachers. Also, working with local communities is absolutely critical. When we were talking about the snow leopards, we mentioned that there's potential for conflict, potential for people getting involved in protecting their wildlife, and that's a very important angle in terms of what we look to do when we're protecting wildlife and stopping poaching. And then also making sure that the correct laws are in place. That's not something for WWF to do, but obviously trying to encourage governments to make sure that they have the right laws to help them target wildlife crime. And rangers, the guardians and protectors of wildlife and nature, are obviously critical. And we need to make sure that they have the right equipment, the right training, and that they have the right support in terms of their own welfare and health insurance and so on. And that's something that WWF and our partners try to help them with. Stopping the trafficking, so that's primarily around understanding what the smuggling routes are that criminals might be using, and they change quite a bit. And then for supporting law enforcement so they can target those trafficking routes and try and intercept seizures and hopefully also catch the criminals involved. And stopping the buying, we mentioned that this is around reducing the demand. So if you think about that chain from poaching through trafficking to demand, it's actually the demand that consumers have for ivory or snow leopard skins or chameleons as pets. That's what actually drives the illegal activity. That's what drives the poaching in the end. So when we're thinking about reducing demand, we need to be thinking about who is buying these products, who's using these products, and what is the best way to engage them so that they change their behavior and stop doing that. And that might be through engaging celebrities. You see someone, martial arts actor in Thailand, and it might be through particular advertising campaigns that seek to influence people in the way that advertisers or marketeers might do for any product. And then you might have things like public commitments or campaigns or petitions that can help engage people in changing behavior so that they're not consuming wildlife products and that pressure that drives poaching isn't happening anymore. So hopefully, over the course of the last 20 minutes, we've got a little bit of a flavour of how issues around illegal wildlife trade are quite complex. We know that illegal wildlife trade is driving some of our most well-loved species like tigers and elephants and others, and with facing them with the threat of extinction. But we also know that it interacts with some of those other threats, things like habitat loss, the challenge that local communities face living with wildlife in conflict. And we know that cultural differences can be important. In some parts of the world, things may be used, for example, pangolin products might be used as a medicine. In other parts of the world, we find that perhaps a little difficult to understand. But we need to understand and respect those cultural differences if we're going to try and address these issues. Demand, particularly in the modern world, is something that can be quite rapidly addressed in the sense that with social media and global trade networks, people can access things and buy things and get things by all sorts of different routes that they couldn't have done even 20 or 30 years ago. And that makes things more complicated. Laws can be different in different parts of the world. The UK, for example, has a ban on ivory trade. Other parts of the world don't necessarily, although there is an international ban, but within country borders, there are different things which can be exploited by criminals. Rangers are obviously critically important for protecting wildlife on the ground. And I'd come back to that idea of the changing world, as we know, with the increasing globalization of the world, we can have the remotest parts of the world can be connected to other parts of the world very, very quickly. So trade can happen, and there's the opportunity for people to move wildlife products from one part of the world to the other side very quickly. And that's something that we need to be able to respond to if we're to protect the wildlife that we want to do. And so finally, when we think about what we can do as individuals, what you can do as individuals, I think doing what you're doing today in terms of being aware, learning about the complexity of the situation, reading, listening, and really making sure that you're informed, asking questions about why things are the way they might be. And when it comes to items that we think might be related to wildlife products that might be illegal or that might be from endangered species, it's very simple in that if you're in any doubt, don't buy. And with that, I'll thank you. I think we'll have some questions in a moment, and I will hand back to Caroline, who I think will introduce Kit.
Cool, thank you so much, Paul. Wow, that was so fascinating, and I can see there's many questions already coming in the Q&A box. So don't forget, if you do have any questions for Paul or Kate, you can drop them in that Q&A box, and we'll get to a few in a minute. But there's some really fascinating facts there. So thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction and explanation into some of the threats illegal wildlife trade is posing to some of our most iconic species. And definitely some of my favourite animals were mentioned there, sadly. So next, we're just going to have a quick introduction from Kate. So Kate, works at a charity called Tale2Tail, and we've been working with Tale2Tail on some of our illegal wildlife trade resources. I think a link has just been put in the chat box. So if you would like to find out more about illegal wildlife trade and look at some of our resources to use in the classroom, I believe there is a link in the chat box now. So I'll just welcome Kate, and maybe Kate, you can tell us a bit more about your fabulous charity.
Well, thank you very much, Caroline. Well, I'm Kate, and I founded a little charity called Tale2Tail, and we create educational material for young people. I am an artist, a writer, a mother, a lawyer, and I've written a little book called An Elephant for Breakfast. But what we do at the charity is we create cool educational resources like this, and like this we've got a play, so kids can perform a play where the young people try and stop an ivory smuggling ring. We've got art lessons with Axel Scheffler, the illustrator of the Gruffalo. He's fantastic. We've also got photography lessons by someone called David Yarrow, who's maybe the world's best wildlife photographer, I think. He takes really breathtaking photos. And what we've tried to do is create fun and interactive materials, and that can help young people as young as Key Stage 1, but also up to Key Stage 3. So we think that it really matters what young people think, and because that's how you stop demand. You stop the end of Paul's slides when they talk about the buying and selling. If you could cut off demand, that would hugely improve and stop the wildlife trade. So our resources are all about education and trying to stop demand that way.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Kate. And you can visit Tale2Tail's website as well if you'd like to know more about her charity. So if I just invite Paul back onto the screen, there's been some fabulous questions in the Q&A, and we'll spend maybe 7 to 10 minutes maybe going through some of these questions before we end today's webinar. So I'm going to start off with a really easy question for both Paul and Kate, and that is, what is your favorite endangered animal?
If I go first, I can take the pangolin, can I? This morning I said the pangolin. I love so many animals, so it's so hard for me to choose. But I really love the pangolin because it's like a type of rubbish collector. So if you could imagine losing the rubbish people who take away all the refuse each week, that's how out of balance the world becomes if you lose pangolin. Because an adult pangolin is supposed to eat about 70 million insects a year. So even one pangolin can make a difference. And they're just extraordinary creatures. And they are one of the most smuggled creature globally. Well, they're the most smuggled mammal.
So yes, as Kate suggested, we when we spoke earlier today, I said pangolin too, and they are fantastic creatures. But from looking at what we spoke about today, as I was growing up, I think it was tigers that really inspired me to sort of fall in love with wildlife and conservation. So I think the striped cat would probably be the one for me. Sadly, they suffer greatly from illegal wildlife trade. If we go back to the start of the 20th century, we estimate there are probably somewhere in the region of about 100,000 tigers, and now we're probably just under 4,000 in total. And although partly that's due to habitat loss, that's also illegal wildlife trade. And tigers are just, I'm sure everyone's familiar with them, they're just such fantastic creatures, and they play such an important role within the ecosystem. They're the top predators, so they help regulate everything else. So I'll go with tiger.
Yeah, I definitely would say tigers and pangolins, both some of my favourite animals that I've also been very lucky enough to see in the wild. So here's a really great question from Rachel that I can pose to both of you as well, Kate and Paul. Do you believe it's possible to end the illegal wildlife trade full stop, and what barriers should be addressed first?
I'm happy to start. So that's a very good question. I think it's always very difficult to end something absolutely, particularly when it's an illegal activity that's got so many complex aspects to it. But by the same token, I think there are many situations where we've seen progress in certain things. For example, I was mentioning tigers, and although there's only just under 4,000 tigers left. Those populations have actually been increasing over the last 10 to 15 years, thanks to the efforts of the countries and the communities and organizations like WWF that have been supporting them. So it's about looking at the different elements. I think I talk about sort of stopping the poaching, stopping the trafficking, and also the demand. And those all have to happen together. And partly that's about what sometimes we call political will, which is this idea that if people care enough, and that's not just ourselves, but people all the way into governments and law enforcement, then they can really address things. And I think we've seen places where it's worked well. I think it's just that idea of keeping the issue alive, treating it seriously. And yeah, I think I'm confident that we can make progress if we try.
Kate, would you like to add anything to that at all?
I would. I also fully believe that we can stop the illegal wildlife trade. I think that grown-ups, the way grown-ups change it is often top down, so the law, and we put things in place, and which is important, but it's just not enough. So if you look at the rhino, for 25 years, it was banned in Asia, in China particularly. You weren't allowed to trade in a rhino tusk, yet the numbers still kept going down because the illegal market continues. And I think what you have to do to actually solve it is have a groundswell from below and have children and young people advocating to stop these things, because without that, you don't get the global change. And if you think of how things spread around the world, I think children and young people are the way things spread the fastest. It's not laws, it's not all the other things. It's actually, you know, this cultural will that comes from below, from the young people and ideas.
Okay, yes, education, of course, very important there. Paul, maybe you can ask this question. So Heather asks, is there an app to report illegal wildlife trade? Or if you suspect something is, what can you do?
So there are a few things that you can do. I suppose the first thing to say is if you think that something is an illegal wildlife product and you encounter it here in the UK, that you should be calling the police, to be honest. And there are lines that you can do there. There are dedicated wildlife crime officers here in the UK. But there's also a wildlife crime app that we have WWF. So that we then pass that on. So Caroline, I don't know if we could stick that into the chat box maybe, or share it after the event. If you're traveling overseas, although no one's doing that right now, but if we do it again and you encounter items that you think might be illegal wildlife trade products, again, there are apps that you can report things on, even if you can't contact local police, and we can share some of those details over the chat, either during the meeting or after.
Okay, brilliant. There was a question, I've just lost it now, but someone did ask earlier, are any animals illegally poached in the UK? Yeah, most definitely, yes. So we have one of the biggest illegal trades that is linked to the UK in terms of its economic value, is the trade in the European eel, which maybe people don't know all that well, but it's a fish that's found in the UK's waters, and when it first arrives back from the sea, it's something that spends a lot of its time in the river and then also spends a lot of its time in the sea. And when it returns back into the river, it's a tiny little eel, and people collect these in huge numbers, smuggle them, traffic them out of the country to other parts of the world where they're fattened up and then consumed. And that is a very lucrative criminal enterprise linked to global criminal gangs. And there are other examples as well. So wildlife crime is something that happens here at home too. Okay, that's super interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that myself, actually. So a user called CRN was asking about rosewoods. I mean, you mentioned a bit about timber as being one of the wildlife products. Could you give us some examples of where these type of timbers are coming from and what other kind of plants are involved in the illegal wildlife trade?
So rosewood is actually a sort of catch-all term for, there's quite a few species of wood that are kind of classed as rosewood, and they come primarily from countries in Africa. Other countries like Madagascar is quite celebrated for its rosewood. And it is one of the highest value illegally traded items in the world, and it's smuggled to not all over, but in particular to Southeast Asia and East Asia. In terms of other plants, we could have spoken today exclusively about plants, actually. But I think I showed a picture right at the start, which was of an orchid. So some of you may be familiar with the ones that you can buy in shops and supermarkets. So there's some very exotic orchids that are traded illegally at ridiculously high prices by collectors. And also some of the sort of succulent plants like desert cacti and things. So there's a whole world of illegally traded plants. And a lot of those end up in Europe, in the UK and North America. So again, another global problem.
Gosh, wow. Here's a question for Kate. I've got a couple I'm going to combine about elephants. So one from Anna and one from CRN. Do African elephants have larger ears than other elephants? And how many African elephants are there now in the wild?
So the answer is yes, African elephants do have bigger ears than Asian elephants. The African elephant is a bit bigger than the Asian elephant. And actually, in a class I did, one child said, and the African elephant has ears the shape of Africa, which I think is true. It's a lovely observation. And the question, how many elephants are left in the wild? Well, the answer is nobody knows exactly. So in 2016, a very clever man called Paul Allen flew planes across Africa for 3 years, and he did what was called the Great Elephant Census, and he counted just over 352,000 elephants. Now, there were some areas he didn't quite get to, so the population was probably a little bit bigger. And in Asia, I think they believe there's between 20 and 40,000 Asian elephants.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah. Of course, elephants. There's a lot of questions here about elephants, and then we're going to go to a couple more. There's been a couple more about ivory, which I'm going to go to Paul, because there's two really interesting questions. So you spoke a bit about mammoth tusks. So we have an anonymous question come in. How is it illegal to dig up mammoth tusks if they are already extinct? And then we had someone else that asked, that is elephant ivory more desirable, I think, maybe over the other animals that also were killed for their ivory? So very interesting questions.
Okay, yeah, they are indeed. So the answer to the first one, partly maybe slightly my fault if I said, so mammoth ivory isn't necessarily illegal, although digging it up in certain parts of the world might well be. If you go to Siberia where they dig it up, they cause tremendous damage, environmental damage in digging it up. Some people think that trade in mammoth ivory might stimulate demand for ivory generally, or it might provide an opportunity for people to launder illegal elephant ivory as well. So there's evidence in that isn't clear, but some people do have that concern. And in terms of which is most popular or valuable, it depends, is the simple answer. Certainly there is a long-standing desire or trade in elephant ivory in certain parts of the world. That said, if you go to Alaska or parts of the Arctic, there's a very long Inuit tradition of carving some of those things like walruses and narwhal tusks that we said as well.
Okay, super. So I'm going to come, there's two more questions that I've just pointed out. One is aimed at Kate, and that is, what inspired you to create an elephant for breakfast?
So I have 3 children, and I think I was on a long car journey and I invented this gang of kids, and at some point they had an adventure, and the actual inspiration for the story was a tiny newspaper article about the size of a postage stamp about smuggling ivory. And I thought, oh, that's a good topic. And then I just read really wildly into this topic. And it gave me a shock, actually. At the time, it was a number of years ago now, I wasn't conscious of the fact that elephants were so endangered. and it shocked me, and that made me write the book and set up a charity and do as much as I could.
Oh, that's really brilliant. I'm going to pick two more questions just because they're quite different to the questions that we've had before. So one of them comes from Tom Whip, and I know this comes from one of our classes that engaged with our live lessons in the last 2 weeks on this topic. So I'm going to pick this question. Is how do you go about changing deep ingrained cultural perceptions of certain wildlife? Maybe Paul, you can link that to some of the work WWF are doing also. So how can we change this demand?
So that is a superb question, because that gets to the nub of one of the great challenges when we talk about demand reduction. And I think as people, we can all probably understand that changing your behavior can be sometimes be quite challenging. But it's about understanding what people's motivations are and why they're doing something. And if you can understand that, then you can look at different ways that you can influence that. And I think one way of looking at it is that things do change. I mentioned in my talk that here in the UK and other parts of Western Europe, we consumed huge amounts of ivory 100 years ago, up until even sort of 20, 30 years ago, a wee bit longer. And we don't anymore. For most of us, it would be culturally totally unacceptable. And those sorts of patterns have happened in other parts of the world as well. Rhino horn used to be consumed in some places and it isn't anymore. So it can be done, but you're right, it's complex and it requires a sound understanding of what motivates people and what those cultural traditions are and how you might influence them, but it can be done.
Brilliant. I think we'll leave it on that. We've just come to 3 o'clock. So thank you everybody so much for watching. This session will also be available on our WWF website, along with our IWT resources, lots of other recorded talks and resources for school. So thank you everybody so much for joining. Sorry if we didn't get to your question. We did have a lot of them there, but it's been fantastic to hear from our experts. So thank you so much, Kate and Paul, for joining us today and talking about this topic with us. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.